This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Become a patron today at patreon.com/intotheportal. Most people will be familiar with the classical biblical tale of Noah. Written in the Hebrew Bible, describing massive floods that washed over the earth, swallowing the lands and all earthly beings, with the exception of a great ark. However, this legend is in fact much, much older than the account described in the book of Genesis. The story of the ark tracing back to a far more distant past, and the legends of ancient Sumeria. Leaving us with the question as to how far back these events go in the timeline of human history, and the many evolutions of religious mythology. Join us on Into the Portal for part 1 in our 3-part series as we search for ancient mythological connections and the possibility of a very real flood that swallowed the world.
Hello, and welcome back into the portal. I'm Amber Ray.
And I'm Andrew McKay.
And we're back with part 1 of an epic series.
Yes, indeed we are.
This ain't biblical. This is pre-biblical.
That's right. Yeah, we can't say this is a story of biblical proportions because it only is in part.
It kind of is, yeah.
Which is really cool, and we're really stoked on this series, and I'm glad that Amber had the idea to do it.
Was that me?
Well, yeah,
I mean,
I think you can. Honestly, yeah, you brought this up. We started watching some documentaries and stuff, and
I guess it all started with that Myths from Mesopotamia book I was looking into, and then I got really stoked on that.
You know, it's kind of funny. It's like we ordered that book to research for our first ever episode on the Lost Army of Cambyses, and here we are over a year later. It's still paying dividends, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, no kidding. All right, before we get into all that, of course, we've got our usual housekeeping. And just right off the bat here, we just wanted to make that announcement that our lucky winner of our Coffee Gator French Press Trivia Contest with ITP is on its way to its lucky owner.
That's right.
So yeah, Darren, you are no longer one of those who never wins anything.
That's right. Congratulations, buddy.
Yeah.
You're about to be making some pretty epic coffee over there. So
totally.
We're pretty excited for you, and you'll be receiving that soon.
Yes, and you know what's interesting? I was actually talking to another one of our listeners, I think this was yesterday even, or the day before, and they made the point, they were like, I don't think maybe a lot of people have heard of a French press before.
Maybe, not necessarily, right? I mean,
it didn't even occur to me.
If you're not a coffee buff, necessarily, you might not have used one before. Yeah, that never really occurred to us, because like we've used them a ton camping and things like that, right?
But you know what's interesting, though? Before I met you, I don't think I had ever used one. So now that actually creates that actually makes sense to me. So what we are going to do is let Andrew give a little explanation as to what a French press actually is.
So it's pretty simple, people. Instead of it being like an automatic coffee maker, it's literally like you have your epic coarse ground coffee beans, and it's literally just like a kind of like a teapot, I suppose you would say. It has a screened press that you would actually push the coffee grounds down with, and I guess I don't know.
I feel like people might be familiar with the term camping coffee more so than French press. I feel like that's really fancy.
It sounds fancy. Like when you say camping coffee, it makes it sound like coffee that's going to like taste like battery acid, but it's French press coffee, when done right, is the best.
And with this Coffee Gator product, the stainless steel, like, what is it? Like, it's vacuum insulated?
Sealed, yes.
Vacuum insulated.
Vacuum insulated, rather, right? Well, but also, too, like when you push it down, like you can feel that there's no air. Like it is like, yeah. So it keeps it hot, and it's just, they're awesome. So that's more or less.
Well, it keeps it hot, and then also reduces the bitterness factor.
Exactly. So yeah, I don't know. That's my my poor description of a French press on an audio podcast here. But seriously, hop over to coffeegator.com and just check out what they have. You'll get a better idea, sort of the other side of the coffee world if you're just used to drip coffee. So yeah.
Exactly. So as ITP's official sponsor, you can receive 15% off your Coffee Gator purchase with our promo code QUARK, spelled QUARK. And that's at checkout. So if you visit coffeegator.com, that's COFFEEGATOR.com today and use our promo code. And yeah, you can, like, seriously, man, this is gonna like change your coffee world.
Absolutely.
Like, coffee world, coffee life. I don't even know. But anyways.
Totally.
Let's get into it.
All right.
Well, actually, before we get into it, sorry, I've got a couple of reviews.
Well, let's get into the
here.
reviews. I thought that's what you meant.
True. And I was really stoked because I just like looked on Stitcher this morning right before we sat down, and we had another 5-star.
Sweet.
And now that I'm looking at it, I copy paste it, and it's like got double the 5 stars. Got 10 stars.
10 stars.
That's so funny. But this was from Anfo11. He wrote this about a month ago. Just says he's really enjoying the show. Discovered it the other day, and if you like things paranormal like I do, you will enjoy the show.
Nice.
Yeah, I was really. He's like excited to see the show grow. 5 stars. I was like, thank you, man. That's
Sweet.
awesome. Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. We had a couple new ones over on the American iTunes as well, which has been great. February's been a really good month. You guys have been showing us lots of love. We really appreciate it.
It's the month of love after all, right?
Hey,
We got Valentine's Day.
There you go. Exactly, right? So this one comes in 5 stars. It's titled Boom. And this is from Wayne Kerr 9.
Oh.
He says, love the topics. You guys are pretty BA, assuming that stands for badass. The different things they discuss are way different than the normal podcasts you listen to. Keep it up. Alan Taylor out. So that's cool. Thanks, man. The other one came from Dan870, and he says, fantabulous, 5 stars. I really like this podcast. The man-eating plants and goblin episodes are my favorite.
Yeah.
So that's pretty sweet.
I loved those episodes, too.
The man-eating plants definitely was one that people seem to latch onto.
It's kind of more obscure than I thought. Because, like, we do get the Venus flytrap as a very mainstream example.
Right.
And then, what was it, Goosebumps? They did that one episode about, or book about that, too.
Yep, that's
Don't
right.
go into the basement.
Exactly. Goosebumps classic.
Yeah, I'd love that. Man-eating plants are coming for you. All right.
No, we're glad you guys are loving it, and so keep those rolling in. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, you ready to dive into this, pun intended, I suppose?
Join the wave.
That's
of
right.
The flood.
So, yeah, like we've said, we're getting into a series on none other than the Great Flood, and people will have Genesis and biblical stories come to mind right away. But we're getting into a whole bunch of different things in this series because this stuff goes way, way back.
Way back.
Pre-biblical.
Oh, definitely. And just to clarify, you said the Great Flood. You can say you can say Great Floods, because potentially we're talking about multiple events happening. Maybe this is a singular. We're going to try and piece those little bits of the puzzle together.
Exactly. So we're going back pretty far. We're going back to the times of the Anunnaki. And no, we're not going to be arguing that they were a race of alien overlords. That is suggested in Ancient Aliens on the History Channel. That's not where we're going with this.
No.
Although they do occupy a very ambiguous space in history in a lot of ways. It's kind of like we'll get into them. We'll discuss them, obviously. They're interesting. Let's just say there's reasons why, obviously, people latch on to the ancient alien argument when it comes to the Anunnaki, right?
Exactly.
So this goes back to pre-Christian stories of the creation of man, really, in the world of gods. So of heroic people rising to the occasion in times of danger, the classic hero's narrative, things like that. And I had to throw in this, my favorite quote, and it's actually funny because I can't remember the name of the movie, but it was from our homunculus episode.
I believe it's Dr. Frankenstein.
Is it Dr. Frankenstein? I just love that part where he says, "Cheers to a new world of gods and monsters." And I just feel like that kind of applies to this era of humanity when we're dealing with gods, demigods almost at the same time, and then humans that are trying to navigate the waters, so to speak, of this world.
Oh, totally. And then even, like you say, gods and monsters. And to me, when you say kind of like put those two side by side, it kind of speaks to this exactly that, like a more ambiguous time, a realm when gods could be monsters or do monstrous things.
Right.
Or are perhaps a little bit more human or closer to, like, you know what I mean? Like, they're not these high in the sky, these like all-knowing, all-powerful, all like, you know, could do no wrong kind of thing, right? Like, these are a lot more morally on par with mankind, or how we see, like, you know, later mythologies deriving through mankind, you know.
Definitely. And less of a gap between the people believing in them and the gods themselves, you know what I mean? Like, whereas today we've got like the church is the intermediary, the people don't really have a connection, and there's the Pope is the connection type thing, right? If you're looking at the Catholic faith.
True.
It was like going way back in the day, it was like, it was more intermingling. It was more just like it was what it was. It wasn't like you have to go to a church to try to contact the god or something like that. You know what I mean?
Even how humans themselves and like ancient leaders were immortalized later on in legend, right? And we saw that when we were talking about the Minoans and Crete and all these examples of like ancient Greek philosophy and mythologies and stuff.
Definitely.
So yeah, a lot more blurring of the lines.
Right, and even more lines are being drawn to past episodes. We can actually make connections even to the Golem when we see mentions of man being created from a mixture of clay and blood of the slain gods. Mm-hmm. So there's definitely some parallels going on here when it comes to creation.
Totally.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
I love it. I love it all. And like the more I uncovered when I was reading through that book, that Myths of Mesopotamia book, I was like, everything's connected. Like, no way. Like, I can't believe this. Like, it's pretty cool, especially when you see things that, like, say, like common tropes in Christian mythologies actually having these much more ancient roots, and it to me it lends a lot more legitimacy to these narratives overall, right? Even if they are being usurped and kind of passed along and transformed over time to kind of suit this cultural and religious zeitgeist of the moment, or whatever you want to call it. You know what I mean? Like, but anyways,
I agree though. It's still interesting. There's the fact that it's being pulled from something that's so much older. It's like there's substance to that. There's something that happened.
There's a nugget.
There's nuggets there to be found. There. Indeed.
So basically, the time and place we're dealing with is ancient Mesopotamia. We're going back to like the Bronze Age, early Bronze Age. Right. So we're talking like before 3000 BCE up till about 1700 BCE for this first sort of part of the series. So this is ancient Mesopotamia. And again, like there's going to be a lot of names of peoples, like, you know what I mean? Like where like they kind of evolve over time. So the first sort of instance of these peoples that have settled the most ancient, like what's known as like the Fertile Crescent, were the Sumers. And there's interesting, there's a little bit of like a north-south split with these people. The Sumers were mostly in the south, the Akkadians mostly to the north, and they kind of were sort of developing side by side until the Akkadians took them over.
Interesting. Okay.
But yeah, so Fertile Crescent. This is the area stretching between the Eastern Mediterranean coast, and then all the way up to like Iran and Iraq and Turkey, and so basically the Persian Gulf. Right. So it kind of is this. It's a crescent. Yeah. It looks like a little baguette or something. I don't know, but
and when we've referred to it before in the Sea Peoples episode and a few other episodes, right? So people should be loosely familiar with the area we're working with.
Exactly, and so. Again, right, this is one of the earliest spots where people started to settle. We see the development of agriculture and animal husbandry and domestication, all this kind of stuff. Right. And so that was going on, began about 15,000 BCE, and then just continued on its trajectory. But essentially, yeah, like you get people like Jared Diamond making a lot of comments about this. Like I remember when we were in school, we read books by him, Niall Ferguson, all these people talking about basically the rise of civilizations and why different civilizations fall and rise and the reasons for such. Mm-hmm. Anyways, and so in this area, we have two very important rivers. And this is actually where the name Mesopotamia is kind of derived, because like Meso means between, and the Potamia is like two rivers, like roughly translated.
Okay, so between two rivers.
Between two rivers, and so it's basically just a huge delta in between them. And it's the Tigris and the Euphrates, and they run roughly parallel to one another through Mesopotamia from the northwest to the southeast. Mm-hmm. And the delta occurs at the eastern end, and it drains into the Persian Gulf. And so, okay, if you can imagine river delta, it's very marshy. Mm-hmm. It needs to be cultivated, and there isn't a lot of natural resources.
Right.
Like, not a lot of wood, not a lot of minerals, not a lot of the elements they needed to make bronze and that type of thing.
Yeah.
So it was kind of one of those more, like, it was one of those, like, it was just characterized by a lack of resources.
Yeah.
How would you describe that? It's like it's like a desolate, sort of poverty-ridden.
Yeah, because they had
naturally.
because obviously, like it's described, it's fertile, but they don't necessarily have the tools they need to work with early on anyway, like things like irrigation, and like they're trying to figure it out.
That's a great point, actually, now that you say that. Because, yeah, Fertile Crescent, obviously you're thinking, oh, this is a natural Garden of Eden, like whatever. But no. It had to be cultivated to actually create that Garden of Eden.
Exactly. Which would have required Bronze Age tools, which they obviously were able to get. But
eventually, yeah, exactly. You see those developments. But it's interesting, right? Because the ancient Mesopotamia, like we've seen in other series, right? Like this is the main mode of organization for like politics and cities is just these independent city-states.
Yes.
Mostly walled in. They had a lot of rivalries between these city-states. Lots of conflicts over water, particularly, and just land. Yeah. Like the diversions of water from these rivers, things like that.
Right.
And there was even moats that were constructed to protect the inhabitants from sieging enemies.
No way.
So it's like almost like, it's crazy, right? Like this is like the medieval times, right? Happening like 3,000 years before all that, or 2,000 years.
That's definitely what it, no doubt, right? With moats. And then we were watching a documentary too, and they made the comment that like even during the actual Middle Ages in Europe, like that's when this area was really kind of like taking a step ahead too. So it's just kind of funny, this comparison here where it's like moats. It's like very much like a medieval Europe, but we're a few thousand years away from that.
Oh, a few thousand. Yeah. Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so essentially what I refer to as Sumer is like this lower half of Mesopotamia. And this is the most anciently settled area. And then I guess it kind of extended up into the north end too with these Akkadians and stuff. And you know what's interesting? I know we talk about a lot of different places in geography when we're talking on the show.
Yeah.
But there was that Anatolia Peninsula that came up quite a bit when we were talking about the Sea Peoples.
Yes.
And that's essentially where modern day Turkey is.
Right.
And so, so if you want to get into it, like the Akkadians kind of were in that sort of realm, so in that upper northern realm of the crescent. Okay. And then the Sumers were occupying that lower, almost like the Syrian, and then in that sort of neck of the woods.
Syria, Lebanon, that type of
Exactly. Area. Yeah, totally. Okay, so let's see, what else we got here? What? This was interesting. I came across this one reference that basically said that this land, the land of Sumer, had the hand of God against it. And so it was because it was so unproductive, like the soil, like I said, lack of natural resources, like these rock formations, like they don't even have rock to work with. Like it's just kind of a nothing.
They're struggling.
A nothing zone, but yet these Sumerians flourished. And this is a cool quote. This was from Sumerians, their history, culture, and character. It says here then was a region with the hand of God against it, an uncompromising land, seemingly doomed to poverty and desolation. But the people that inhabited it, the Sumerians, as they came to be known by the 3rd millennium BC, were endowed with an unusually creative intellect and venturesome, resolute spirit. In spite of the land's natural drawbacks, they turned Sumer into a veritable Garden of Eden and developed what was probably the first high civilization in the history of man.
Yeah.
End quote. So that really beautifully sums up everything that I've been trying to say.
Seriously, it's really, really impressive. And one of the main things, like just for sort of like to give some context here in terms of like their water supply, because dealing with the Tigris and the Euphrates, obviously massive rivers, like, and you're thinking, whenever we think irrigation, ancient irrigation, I'm always thinking of like the Egyptians, right? And how they were able to kind of like, irrigate their fields and this, that, and the other thing.
They purposely flooded the Nile at certain points
too. Exactly. And it was predictable. Like that's the point I was going to make. So it's like the Nile was much more predictable. They knew when the floods were coming and they could direct them where they needed to. Whereas the Tigris and the Euphrates weren't predictable. They didn't have that same time of year type deal where they could time it and have these diversions for their crops. So they needed to be more on top of it. They need to be more creative and a little bit more. Their ancient engineers were a little bit more, had more to deal with.
Exactly. And then it's so interesting because that plays into the mythology, and their gods are much the same. Like the nature of them, they're unpredictable. They're kind of what's the word? Not wishy-washy, but they're kind of like, they'll say one thing and then they'll go back on it.
They're fickle. They're fickle
They're
gods,
very fickle pickles.
right?
But yeah, no, that is a really interesting point. And again, right, like the Sumers, and when we get into the actual stories themselves, how basically what the gods are portrayed as their reality is really the reality lived on the ground by the people.
Pretty much.
And how they've had to work so hard and to achieve what they've achieved.
Yeah, that's right.
But anyways.
So let's talk a little bit about what else they did, these ancient Sumerians, because
There's so many things.
It's pretty incredible, right? And when you think of things like even the wheel, you might your brain might go back to like picturing some sort of like Stone Age person chiseling out a wheel. And that's almost where we're at with the early ancient Sumerians, right? This was like pre-Bronze Age, moving into the Bronze Age, and they straight up invented the wheel because they needed to in this area to get stuff around because they didn't have the same waterways, they didn't have the same ability to move stuff.
They did start their cities along the rivers
Of course,
for transportation.
like all civilizations do, are always next to water or by water.
But that's interesting that you say the wheel, right? Because we saw that in that one documentary we were watching where they invented the wheel as part of their irrigation technology.
Right. Yeah, okay, yeah, that was the connection I was trying to make there. The wheel in relation to their water system and their needs there being very different than other places in the Near East or the Middle East, right?
Exactly.
So the wheel. They also invented the 12-month calendar, and they divided up the hours into like 60 seconds, minutes, and hours. So they actually like were the ones who broke up that concept throughout the day.
That's pretty cool.
Pretty insane. They were the first human civilization to have a code of law. So 1792 to 52 BCE, the Hammurabi, as it was
so that
referred
was that
to.
one guy who's like a Babylonian king, Hammurabi.
Right.
Or Hammurabi. I'm not even saying
Hammurabi. That's a fun word to say. Hammurabi. It sounds like a hot sauce or something.
It probably is.
Probably is. They were also known to have an unusual flair with technological innovation, though, right? So we've already talked a little bit about their irrigation. They had sailboats that were quite profound for the time.
Oh, and those round boats, too.
Oh, that's right.
The ferry boats.
That's something really, really, really important to this and the idea of a flood that we'll get into later on. Round boats that you don't see anywhere else in the world. Pretty bizarre. They also had a very specific plow that they invented. The archway. So they were constructing things, like architectural feats, domes, vaults.
Oh, the round building. It's like this round frame, and that was a really cool one. And that was kind of played into the boat technology again, too, right? Similar principle.
Right. Totally. And then, of course, casting in copper and bronze, they probably would have ended up having vast trade networks up to the UK and things like that, where tin was coming from, right?
You know where it would have come from? No, not even that. It would have come from the Anatolia Peninsula, because that had a ton of natural, like the raw metals.
Lots of tin to actually make bronze.
Tin and copper.
Tin and copper. Interesting, okay. Because I remember we mentioned during the Sea Peoples episode, I guess this is, we're in a slightly different location here, though, but like the Minoans would have been possibly trading tin.
Oh, true.
Further north.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But anyway.
They're all in the same neck of the woods.
Same neck of the woods. Who knows what the trade routes could have been. So, okay. Yeah, I mean, all this was necessary to control like we said already, the unpredictable rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And they needed these very, very, very complex systems of irrigation in order to basically survive. They grew wheat, millet, barley. And because of how effective their irrigation was, they could actually sometimes harvest these twice a year.
Exactly.
Which was unheard of.
Well, the irrigation, exactly. Irrigation that could, basically, they would flood the fields and then it would help regenerate the nutrients in the soil and all this kind of stuff.
Exactly.
And then they would rotate their crops too.
Right.
Oh, you know what's interesting too that I totally forgot? We were talking about how they have like basically no resources, no wood. These boats were predominantly made from reeds. So reeds was like their main building substance.
Yeah.
Like they didn't have lumber really.
No.
They didn't have a lot of the stuff that we would normally use to build stuff.
They built entire palaces out of compressed reeds that were more durable than brick in some cases.
Compressed reeds, eh? Wow.
Like we saw it in the documentary the other day. Like literally like columns. It's like it looks like you're inside of like a medieval church. Like how vaulted and massive it is. It's literally made out of reeds compressed.
Oh wow! I'm thinking of that one, the city of Ur. That was definitely made of stone. That was not.
They of course would have had structures like that too, though. That just aren't there anymore, obviously. But
or crumbling and decaying now. There's a few sites that are. quite prominent, but it's hard to get to them because they're in Iraq, and it's kind of just...
Yeah, well, obviously right now it's not...
not the best place to be.
Not, I mean, you probably get some pretty cheap vacation rentals out there these days.
Yeah, like all
like
inclusive.
free. Like
they pay you to stay there?
They pay you, yeah. Yeah. Okay. I had a joke there, but I'm not gonna say it.
Oh, man.
All right. But, okay, so just to cap off what I was saying there, though, they're pretty intense people, these ancient Sumerians. They've set the stage for like the next era of human civilization, that is the Bronze Age, right? Where we saw these crazy things happen, like the Sea Peoples, and these events that changed human history. Yeah. But one of the most important things about them was that they contain the earliest examples of organized religion, these ancient Sumerians.
I know, right? It's kind of cool. And, like, these people, they're so level-headed, they're so pragmatic, they're so industrious. And I feel like their religion closely followed in those footsteps.
Yes.
And like we mentioned before, like, it is a polytheistic religion, and so their gods oftentimes are as unpredictable as their natural world, which I find very telling. It's very relevant to all the things we're going to be discussing as far as this great flood event. And
that's why we're trying to build this up, right? Like we're going back to the ancient roots of the flood. So we want everyone to be familiar with who these people are and the nature of the religion and the context.
The context, because why do we have these narratives, and why do they persist, and why do they transform and change and become inducted into all these different types of religious traditions?
Exactly.
That's the nugget that's so fascinating to me, because it's like, this is cool, man. Anyway, sorry. I'm a complete nerd. But anyways, yeah, so they're gods, unpredictable. A lot of them are around. There's almost like a hierarchy of gods too. And I thought this was really interesting. Like, again, right? So these Sumerians have no grand illusions about any sort of, like, no fluffiness, no, like, like, New Testament forgiveness or anything like that.
No, none of that. No niceties like that.
No niceties. They're even more hardcore than the Old Testament. And it says here, I had this one note, heaven, so the afterlife, because this, again, is quite significant, this whole conversation. Heaven was reserved exclusively for deities. So not for humans. And upon their deaths, as in human deaths, all mortal spirits, regardless of their behavior while alive, were believed to go to Kur, K-U-R, which was a cold, dark cavern deep beneath the earth, and was ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal. Ereshkigal. And the only food available to eat is dry dust. So you essentially go to hell.
So why would you ever listen at all?
I know. It just makes
I would be rebelling every day.
But the thing is, though, when we get into the whole genesis of man and why they were created in the first place, it kind of comes to make sense. But anyways, so again, fascinating parallels to our past episodes discussing this whole spiritual aspect of the Earth's depths.
Yeah.
I find this really cool. And again, right, journeying to a cavern deep in the underworld, in the earth, the underworld, right? I'm thinking ancient Egyptian mythology, all that kind of stuff. And how increasingly so, like even with our last series, the goblins, right? I'm thinking that, and even with our series with Minoan Crete, how there was that one underground cavern that was quite substantial for their religious practices. Yes. And they had like a whole idol to this one goddess in there. Yeah. And they would get like high on, what was it again? They had something going on there. Anyways, it was a whole spiritual thing.
What was it?
But again, right, it speaks to the idea that these are possibly physical places, or there are representations of these metaphysical places.
Exactly.
That can kind of maybe blend into maybe those miners that we were talking about last week. Maybe they stumbled upon something to do with the Duat or the underworld or whatever they're talking about here with this Kur.
Quite possibly.
What if you made your way to Kur? That's crazy.
I'm even seeing some connections here too with the dry dust. Even connected to the golem, the idea of them breathing life into an inanimate object with like dust, like with like, the fragments of the earth or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting here. It's like these people sent to this cold, dark cavern. All you have to eat is this dry dust. It's like that's just the most raw, fundamental element of like life.
Totally. That's what we are.
Yeah.
And so that's what you eat. Well, that makes so much sense.
Sort of weird, right?
It's so cool. So again, right, yeah, just to reaffirm, they're going into the depths of the earth. They're not going up to the heavens. No. And we will see this, I don't even want to call it a binary because I feel like it's a lot more confusing and not as clear as just like a dualistic kind of atmosphere between the gods themselves. Because you see, we're not going to get into all of the fundamentals of Sumerian religion, but essentially there are sky realm, earth realm, there's like an under earth realm, there's all
like
sorts of things going
a duat type
on.
deal.
Exactly. And then there's different people that rule over these, like Enki is god of the earth realm kind of thing. And then he has a huge part to play in the creation of man ultimately.
Right.
But anyways.
So, I mean, yeah, and very much like we just said, the duat and this and that and the other thing. We've mentioned Egyptian religion many, many times, and very much like that in all religions, like this played a significant role in the actual makeup of society, of the politics, of the day-to-day political society for the ancient Sumerians, where the first leaders of these city-states were essentially... they were the priests. They were the theocratic officials.
The shamans. Those closest to the spiritual realm.
Exactly, right? So Atrahasis and how do I pronounce this other one? Zisudra is an example of one.
Okay, and though that is totally decontextualized right now, but those are essentially the heroes of our flood stories.
Exactly, for the Sumerian flood story.
Same person, different name.
Exactly. So these were the rulers before we had kings supplant them.
Right.
And come in and basically kind of, take over and be the non-demigod rulers, I guess you would even say, potentially.
Yeah, and then it's interesting too because in the very earliest versions, you get the priests are kind of the leader, right? They're the hero that builds the ark and then leads the salvation of mankind or whatever.
Right.
But then later on, we get the kings kind of supplanting these spiritual leaders. You get different versions of these same stories where it's essentially human corruption is the cause of the flood.
Okay.
It's not other reasons that are a little more simplified that we'll get into in a second here.
Right.
But yeah, it's interesting. You get a progression of the reasons why the flood happens in the first place.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm looking forward to getting into this. But another massive aspect that connects to this flood story is that the ancient Sumerians had this very interesting boat technology centered on the use of reeds predominantly, like we already mentioned a few minutes ago. So these reed boats were the main method of transportation along the Euphrates and the Tigris, usually built to be obviously much, much smaller than what you would picture as an ark.
So cute. They look like big umbrellas that people
they really
just,
do
float in.
Totally. It's like the teacup ride from Disneyland, but like a boat, and you're scooting around the river and getting your fish and stuff.
And they're
like that.
very stable, apparently.
Really? No, absolutely. Which makes perfect sense, right? I mean, if you're in a circle rather than like a canoe
That's
shape,
tippy,
right?
exactly.
A little bit more stable. Yeah, really, really interesting because this is the type of technology that would have been able potentially, So
to build a ark,
to build
like a super boat.
Exactly. Something that would have balanced itself. You got elephants on one side and something on the other side. Then you're gonna have something a little bit more buoyant and.
Yeah, elephants. They gotta go right in the middle.
Right. But yeah, these boats and ancient Sumerian technology have been proven to be effective in building a vessel that would technically be big enough to be called an ark and house a grouping of people and animals that could have been, at least large enough to latch on to this legend, to be this legend
Exactly.
in history, which is pretty neat. So, yeah, and the ancient cultures that followed, so the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Akkadian empires, they all contain stories of this massive flood event, just like the ancient Sumerians.
Exactly. So that's where I'm talking about, these whole later progressions and, additions and revisions in the story and whatever else. It's so fascinating.
It totally is. So let's get a little bit more context as to who these preceding empires were. So after the Sumerians, we get the Akkadians, the Akkadian Empire.
Yeah, and that was kind of what I referred to right off the bat, where it was the Akkadians were kind of more so in the north, kind of bordering on the Anatolia Peninsula sort of region.
Right.
And they kind of existed together
simultaneously
until the Akkadian takeover.
Oh, okay. So they almost had the Akkadians and the Sumerians would have been speaking a common dialect and things like that.
Totally.
Okay.
And they had very much, they had a lot of connections, a lot of trade, a lot of just just back and forth.
Right, and obviously they're functioning in the same area. So the Akkadian Empire is exercising their influence across Mesopotamia, the Levant, Anatolia.
Exactly.
They're sending military expeditions as far south as Dilmun and Magan, which are basically modern Oman.
Exactly.
So the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula.
And so it was kind of peaking in and about 2400 BC was kind of the timeline there. So a little bit after 3000
Right,
BC.
because it was established around the third millennium. So
exactly.
okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
So, but then eventually, of course, we have the Canaanites and the Israelites and their mythologies, and we've referenced them before from the Sea Peoples episodes. And of course, the Canaanites and Israelites are like the most epic biblical enemies of each other. They hate each other. That's exactly. That is the most, like, if you're going to do like a ancient UFC cage match, like it is going to be like these two groups of people. So, but their mythologies are filled with stories of massive flood events as well. Of course, that wipe out, the majority of people and leaving just very few remainders, including, of course, a hero figure. And we're all familiar with Noah and Noah's Ark, of course. Noah. But the Sumerian stories predate the Hebrew Bible by over 2,000 years. And they're believed to have been the very, very first renditions of this tale, like we've made reference to already. But they weren't actually written down until the early 17th century BC on clay tablets. Or even earlier. And I don't know if I actually mentioned this before. I think I should have, or I did. But the Sumerians invented one of the earliest form of writing. Did we not mention this? I think we accidentally skipped over it. So let's just touch on that then.
Yeah, cuneiform.
Cuneiform. Very, very interesting. It looks like little bird feet.
It's essentially wedge writing. So you have like a stylus that is like a wedge shaped thing, and you're just basically imprinting into clay.
Exactly. And
never wrote on a paper.
No papyrus, no paper, like the Egyptians' papyrus. But what is really interesting about this is it's not just writing in terms of, like when we were talking about even the Minoans, when we were talking about like Linear B and those types of languages, this cuneiform was emphasizing the consonants of words, which was really interesting. Right?
Even before that, it was literally just the picture symbol of what it was depicting.
Exactly.
It was like literally just a stalk of wheat.
Exactly. And then it would change into being like wheat, the word, like as it would sound, which is pretty neat because that's basically, that's exactly how our lettering functions right now. They have sound, consonants attached to the phonetics, right? And then we spell things out. And you're going to reference this guy in a minute here, but it's actually really easy to learn, which is pretty cool.
Really? Is that what he said?
Yeah, so he actually had a bunch of...
This is Irving Finkel.
So the Irving Finkel...
the British Museum of Antiquities.
Exactly. He had a bunch of British school kids there. I think they looked to be about grade 4 or 5. And he was teaching them cuneiform, and they were learning it super fast. They were like writing their own little fairy tales and stories and stuff.
Cute.
So... super profound, but also something that like the masses could learn.
Makes sense,
which is pretty crazy to think, right?
That's cool.
But before we get into Finkel here, though, because he's the guy who actually deciphered this flood myth from these ancient Sumerian tablets, right?
Yeah, totally.
So these stories predate the Hebrew Bible 2,000 years. The story itself was found at the site of Nippur on these tablets. Okay, so this is the oldest Sumerian city and the seat of worship for Enlil, the Lord of Wind. Okay.
And that makes sense if you look at pictures of this place, because it literally looks like this would be the windiest, very most desolate place.
Totally.
Ever. It's just like this huge monolithic thing.
Right, no kidding, right? Yeah, and then the other sites across the Mesopotamian region, there's been other tablets and things like that found as well. And they tell this creation of man.
Exactly.
And more specifically, more importantly for this episode, they talk about a great flood. Yeah.
So this Irving Finkel guy, he is the renowned cuneiform expert, and he does work with the British Museum of Antiquities. And he's such a funny looking guy. Oh my goodness, I love him so much. He looks like the guy that had the Philosopher's Stone or something.
Oh yeah,
looks like he's straight out of Harry Potter.
Yeah,
man.
What's that guy's name again? Come on. I always want to say Paracelsus, and it's never Paracelsus. It's the other one, the other alchemist guy. Oh God, just brain fart right now. So bad. Never mind. I'll think on it. You get going here.
Nicholas Flamel.
God.
I just needed to rearrange my brain.
There you go.
All right. So yeah, Irving Finkel looks like Nicholas Flamel. That was the point we're going.
That's the point, yeah.
But anyways, yeah, so he works with the British Museum of Antiquities, and he studied this language his entire academic career, and you can tell it's been a long one because he's got a beard that's probably down to the floor by now. And anyways, he was presented, okay, so there's this really interesting, totally fascinating story, and again, it's like the synchronicities is so weird. We've been joking about synchronicities all week.
Yeah, we have.
But anyways, yeah, so he was presented, okay, so this man who was like a British British dude, whatever, living in Britain.
Very specific, Amber.
Yeah, very specific. Anyway, so he actually had a father that went traveling back in the day, way before this guy was ever born. He went to Damascus. And while he was in Damascus, he was in the markets and these like massive markets. And he came across all this pottery and all these like pieces, and he ended up buying this one piece of pottery that was it was small. It's like the size of your palm, and it's a rectangular shape, and it had this strange symbols all over it on either side. Then they didn't know what the heck it was. They kind of forgot about it. It was sitting in the house for like 40 years, and the man passed away, and his son, he discovered it, and he's like, you know what, this could probably be significant. Let's just take this to the museum. And so thank God he did, because this was literally the missing piece of the puzzle. And so Irving Finkel, the way he describes it, was like he essentially took one glance at this thing and realized he was reading the original flood story, like way before Noah, way before, like
the
thousands.
Flood story.
Exactly, the flood story. So yeah, the parallels and specifics of this tale point to the idea that this is not coincidence, that essentially the versions that we see in the Old Testament and in the Hebrew Bible have been derived from these earlier versions. And
which blew people's minds.
Yes, like this was like exactly unheard of. The Bible at this point was like the oldest historical document that we basically had in our possession.
More or less, yeah.
More or less. Like there could have been others as well, but again,
as far as like being detailed and establishing timelines of religion, like absolutely, like the Hebrew texts are the ones that they're working with. This changed it all.
So this again, yeah, it just sets the timeline back so much further, and then again puts those missing pieces of the puzzle together, right? Because as they start reading this, they're like, they realize, and even more tablets, right? As they come into their possession, they're realizing like they're putting together all these pieces, because unfortunately these tablets were highly damaged.
Of course.
And so you get like less than a third sometimes that's actually readable.
Yeah.
Which is really unfortunate. But anyways, yeah. So Finkel and his British museum people, they basically put together the last pieces of the puzzle. And again, right, like, okay, so this was the Sumerian. But what we're going to see is the Akkadian tradition kind of broaden the narrative and add more elements in. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to, oh man. So yeah, we already kind of cleared up the sort of muddiness between like Sumerians and Akkadians, and this idea that the Akkadian dialect, this is weird. Like, it's not weird to me, but sometimes like you hear Assyrian, you hear Akkadian, you hear Babylonian, you're like, what the heck are all these people? You know what I mean? Yeah. But essentially all you need to know is that they're all in the same neck of the woods. We're all talking about the same Mesopotamia in different points of history.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And they would have all had different sort of evolutionary trajectories with their like language and stuff, but it would have been like similar. There would have been commonalities, obviously, like in the region, right?
And so another confusing part of this too is like, so they're getting a bunch of these clay tablets, and they're kind of spread. Like the oldest ones are more so in the east, like in the Iraq sort of region, and then as writing spreads throughout Mesopotamia, it goes more westward.
Right.
Is kind of the trajectory, but again, yeah, so we've got so much of this lost. Like sometimes you can see more than 20 or 30 lines are lost in a single section kind of thing. And so it's hard to piece together and comprehend the overall themes and stories as part of this like very complex literary tradition. Mm-hmm. It's super complex. Definitely. And again, right, like, yeah, like, I don't even know, like. But
it's pretty crazy though, like how, okay, so, but it's interesting how Finkel went about actually deciphering what he had to work with. Like,
that's true.
Right? Because obviously there's a lot that's lost, there's a lot that can't be seen, but they went about it in a very similar way to almost like the Antikythera mechanism when we mentioned in our Ancient Technologies episode.
Oh, that's so true.
Where they did a 3D scan of this scroll, essentially what it was, similar to the Dead Sea Scrolls as well, where they had to go through using basically like a X-ray, essentially, right? And he was able to analyze it in 3 dimensions without damaging it any further.
Mm-hmm. And to pick up all those little tiny details that might have been missed. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's just pretty sweet. I mean, like when we're working with, you can't even imagine what it'd be like for, you know, people discovering these types of artifacts in the 20s and 30s and 40s and stuff when they're out there with the Royal Geographic Society and stuff like that, right? And then they have no way of interpreting anything.
No, it's just
you're just gonna crush it to dust, or you're right. Like it was
imagine
a different
how much
world.
was lost even before all of this. Hey,
99.999% of all evidence for anything ever.
Anyways, yeah. So once Finkel had made this discovery, again, right? Like this is a huge revolution in deciphering ancient mythologies, ancient religion, all this kind of stuff. And before we actually get into, because we're going to do some readings here, and we're going to get into the early Sumerian version and then the Akkadian/Babylonian versions.
Yes. Yeah.
But before we do that, I think one other thing that's important to mention is the fact that, like you already said, we're going to see the Anunnaki in these stories. And they don't really have any context in the story, but my question was, like, how do these guys fit into Sumerian religion? Because they're almost referred to as, like, this separate sky realm or something like that. And so, again,
the
right?
ancient alien stuff.
That can get misinterpreted. Indeed. Huge. Yeah. But essentially, the Anunnaki, or Anunnaki? I don't know.
I mean, in Ancient Aliens, they say Anunnaki.
Anunnaki?
I don't think it really...
Anunnaki?
I'm sure there's a few different
I'm going to say
pronunciations.
No, I'm just kidding. But anyways, so there's sort of a hierarchy of Sumerian deities, or classification system, I guess. And it's interesting because the majority of these deities belong to what's called the Anua. Anua?
Okay.
Anuna? I don't know how to say that. It's spelled Anunnna. And it basically just means, like, it's offspring. And so, okay, this is kind of confusing. But again, there's these two, there's Enlil and Inanna. And so those are two gods. And essentially... Oh, wait, no. Do I have that right here? I'm getting a little confused. I think offspring of An and Ki are basically the Anunnaki.
Oh,
it's kind of how that sort of
this
translates.
this is what I mentioned before. It's like we're in this era, we're dealing with this sort of like jumbled context of, like you said, like there's three different realms almost. That almost describes demigod to me, right? Like they're, you know what I mean? Like they're offspring of.
Sorry, I think I have that confused. Enlil and Inanna are part of the Anunnaki.
So they are the offspring.
And essentially, I don't know, maybe we should scrap the word offspring.
Okay.
But essentially, what the Anunnaki are is these 7 deities that are actually referred to as these underworld judges. And so, again, it's almost like a council. And we see that a lot, right? In Greek mythology, you get the council of the gods. You get people, they're elements of democracy all over the place, but they basically vote on stuff.
Right.
And there's votes cast, there's appeals made to a group of people, right? It's not just like one supreme leader. Mm-hmm. And so that's where, when we get into these stories, we're going to see the Anunnaki as essentially the decision makers. And we're not referring to aliens. I just want to make that perfectly
I think people
clear.
are aware that we're not referring to aliens here.
I've just got to say
But
it one
again,
more
like
time.
that's another reason why people would say that they are.
True.
Right? Like that they're making these decisions, or that they have this
the
council of the whatever.
alien
and, like,
overlords kind of thing. And
the
whatever
reptilian
else.
overlords.
And again, like there is sort of a lot of vagaries associated with all these people too. Well, all these mythologies and stuff. So
Definitely.
Again, right, open to misinterpretation as well as interpretation.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that is a good spot for us to take a little bit of a break.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to get into some more of this early Sumerian flood story in just a second. But before we do, we are going to take a very quick promo break for Coffee Gator.
Yeah.
Are you a coffee fiend like us? Then Coffee Gator is about to become your new best friend. Coffee Gator is creating products that are simple to use, made of quality materials, and have a beautiful aesthetic.
Oh my god, that pink series is amazing.
It really is. But, of course, there is something for everyone. Coffee Gator will up your coffee game whether you are an instant coffee fan or an espresso addict.
Seriously. They've got every accessory under the sun. From stainless steel canisters, pour-over systems, cold brew coffee making kits, and insulated glass mugs. They have the tools you need to make your best cup yet, including helpful tips and tricks on their website. So, simply use promo code QUARK, spelled Q-U-A-R-K, to get 15% off your purchase at coffeegator.com. That's 15% off your purchase using promo code QUARK, spelled Q-U-A-R-K, at checkout. So visit coffeegator.com today.
Start drinking better coffee with Coffee Gator. And we're back. Okay, so we're jumping back into... I keep having these water puns. Diving in, jumping in. But let's get back into the early Sumerian flood story in Eridu Genesis. So this is kind of like, the Sumerian Genesis story, essentially, right?
Exactly. So like the earliest version. And it's very vague too, or not vague, but it's very piecemeal.
Right.
A lot of it's been lost.
Indeed, that's right. So we were talking about Mr. Finkel and his how he was able to decipher some of these.
Finkel.
I've had that on the tip of my tongue since we've said that name. Shout out to my favorite film, no, one of my favorite comedies.
So good.
Love some Ace Ventura.
Oh.
Okay, but these tablets, like you said, only 2/3 of them. Or sorry, a lot of it wasn't decipherable, but it's estimated that actually over 2/3 of the tablets containing this story have been destroyed, but he was still able to pull the juicy meat of it from one of those main tablets, right?
Not even though. That's kind of funny. Like you said, the main juicy. It's like, no. Basically what you get is a lot of... sometimes it'll be a single word or legible in a line. Sometimes it'll be like 30 lines missing, or you'll get halfway through a line and then there'll be like the actual subject is lost. So you get a lot of partialities. And when I was reading through some of this, I was like, this is so frustrating. Like I'm getting like, like you get to a little bit that sounds like it's about to go somewhere and then it's just cut off and it's just like lost.
But there was the one larger tablet though that had a chunk of that story on it.
Yeah, it did.
That they emphasized as being like, that was the key to being like, hey, okay, like there's a few other bits missing from it, but like that's the crux of, of the flood story.
You get the framework of it all.
Yeah, exactly. So like we just said, so along with the story of man's creation, there's also this great flood, purportedly, sent by God to destroy mankind for a bunch of different reasons.
Gods, not God.
Sorry, right. We're not dealing with a single God yet. That's right. It's not monotheistic yet.
Exactly.
So the gods are choked for various different reasons, right? Okay, and there are several elements that continue into later traditions, like such as the reason the gods destroy man. So, okay, here they are. One of them is that they're too noisy. Keep it down there. You guys are making way too much noise.
Yeah.
Later versions are talking about possible just human corruption.
Yeah.
Things like,
Oh, there's some that are saying like overpopulation. Like there's one reference to like the city with half-filled baskets.
Right.
So that again points to famine.
Exactly. So in this ancient version, 7 days and 7 nights of rain bring this flood.
That's a pretty good... That's a very consistent element in a lot of these. The 7 days, 7 nights.
Right.
Until we get into the Old Testament.
Exactly. And there's a reference to the hero releasing birds in order to try to discover land, after which the land has all been swallowed up by water. So that's another parallel we see in the Genesis story that we'll obviously get to.
Exactly. I believe it's 3 birds released, and then the third one comes back, and I think it has like an olive branch in it.
Yeah, I think that I believe so. So, and in this early story, the hero is Atrahasis, who we've mentioned, but he's referred to by his Sumerian name of... Oh my gosh.
Ziusudra.
Ziusudra. Okay. And is the ruler of the city of Shurupak? Shurupak. So a throne that was actually passed down to him from his father. And Atrahasis is in tune with the gods. So he's almost like this kind of demigod.
He's always described as the man with his ear to God kind of thing. Or like he has his eyes open to God. Or
exactly.
Godza or whatever.
He's actually even known as the priestly king of men. Yeah. Which is interesting.
Again, so that plays into the whole, like, this is the very, very early version of the story. At the time, Sumerian culture would have been ruled over by priest kings.
Right.
Or just priests as rulers.
Exactly.
So Ziusudra was one of these people.
Right, and he was described as like a seer, so like a visionary, like someone who could be... who could obviously like predict things, or at least he had a connection to the spiritual realm. So very much like, again, like Noah talking to God.
Totally.
And being given these messages, right?
Heeding the warning.
Exactly. So he heeds these warnings of the gods as illustrated in a passage from this Sumerian Genesis, which basically says, and as Ziusudra stood there beside it, he went on hearing, step up to the wall to my left and listen. Let me speak a word to you at the wall, and may you grasp what I say. You may heed my advice. By our hand a flood will sweep over the cities of the half-bushel baskets and the country. The decision that mankind is to be destroyed has been made. A verdict, a command of the assembly cannot be revoked.
That is so rich, full of so much stuff. The idea, yeah, exactly. So Ziusudra is the only one listening. So again, it speaks to the idea that man has kind of shut himself off. If you want to play into that whole, like, man is too noisy, it doesn't hear God anymore kind of thing. And then the whole, the reference to the half bushel basket, so famine element. And also the verdict. A command of the assembly. So that's where you got a democratic element there, where it's like they voted on this. The gods have voted on your demise.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
I love that. That's so fascinating. And it cannot be revoked. There is no going back.
Right. There's no court of appeal.
Exactly. And sorry, just the guy that's actually speaking to Ziusudra right now is Enki, the guy that I mentioned that's the god of the earth realm.
Right.
And he has a big part to play in the actual creation of man that we'll see in a second in this later version of the whole thing. But anyways, so yeah, the story does continue on with Ziusudra listening to Enki and building the ark as ordered by him. And essentially what happens is, very much like Noah, builds this thing, loads it with pairs of animals. And this is a quote. This is when the actual flood hits.
Okay.
All the evil winds, all stormy winds, gathered into one, and then with them the flood was sweeping over the cities of the half-bushel baskets for 7 days and 7 nights. After the flood had swept over the country, after the evil wind had tossed the big boat about on the great waters, the sun came out, spreading light over heaven and earth. Think of the two realms, heaven and earth there. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this, again, this is a very, very piecemeal, very simplified early version.
Yeah.
And then we're going to see more elements added in as we get the sort of Semitic, Akkadian, and Babylonian traditions. And again, right, like we've already kind of loosely referred to this, but I have a note here just saying how there was a lot of cultural exchange happening with the Semitic Akkadian peoples of the northern Mesopotamia region for generations prior to this usurpation and ultimate takeover by the Akkadians in Sumeria.
Right, okay.
Yeah. And this happened, like I said, about 1300 BCE. It's this guy Sargon of Akkad. Sargon. Doesn't that sound like something from like Lord of the Rings?
Absolutely sounds like something from Lord of the Rings.
Exactly. So, again, right, we get this rapid integration of Sumerian mythology and religious practices, and a blending of this original sort of Sumerian flood story into Akkadian belief systems.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so all these deities that were developed in Sumerian culture kind of take on Akkadian counterparts. Where else have we seen this? What was it first? Like what came first? The chicken or the egg? With the Greeks and the... oh my god, I'm totally blanking right now. Like, the Greek gods were based off of the earlier versions of...
in Egypt, right? Like,
Egypt,
is that what you're referring to? In like Herodotus, where they're just basically like replacing a bunch of the... Yeah.
Exactly.
Totally.
Yeah, so we get this sort of blanketing over. It's almost like it's an overlay over top of the original Sumerian system.
Right. Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And so that's where we kind of get into this whole another version of the tale of Atrahasis.
That's right. So we end up essentially with this blended epic from the Akkadian and the Babylonian traditions, like you've alluded to here, involving this creation of man and then the great flood narrative to go along with it.
And this is way more developed now. So
it just keeps adding more and more as we go along here, which is so cool. It's like just the development of human history with this and myth making. Absolutely love it. So written down in the mid 17th century BCE, the story of Atrahasis can be dated by the colophon. So
it would have been like an emblem or something imprinted onto the text. So obviously it wouldn't be a title page or spine of a book, but that's just a modern
interpretation of it.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So this would have been dated to the reign of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, who we've mentioned a few minutes ago, the great... Sorry. The reign of the Babylonian king Hammurabi's great grandson.
Oh yeah.
Rather. So this is this is a little bit later.
Yeah.
Ami Saduj, 1646 to 1626 BCE. Although obviously, like we've said a million times, the tale itself is considered to be much, much older, passed down through these oral traditions. So, but we're going to continue on with the story here.
Yeah. So we're almost taking a little bit of a backtrack because we're actually going to be getting into the original story of man's creation. And so that tale actually begins with relating the story of the labors of these gods. They're really hard workers, apparently, and their labors were so great and so strenuous that one day they just decided to lay down their tools and labor no more, going on strike while they protested to the Council of the Anunnaki.
Interesting.
Yeah. So this aspect of the story, while not directly related to the flood narrative, it does set the stage for what's to come later, and I believe it's very revealing as to the nature of the gods and what humans were ultimately intended for.
Yeah.
And then how this kind of backfires on these great gods in the end. Insert eye roll. And anyways, okay, so this is from the very beginning here. Quote, "When the gods, instead of man, did the work, bore the loads. The gods' loads were too great, the work too hard, the trouble too much. The great Anunnaki made the Ajiji carry the workload sevenfold. Anu, their father, was king. Their counselor warrior, Iliel. Their chamberlain was Ninurta. Their canal controller, Enugi. Cast the lots. The gods made the division. Anu went up to the sky, and Iliel took the earth for his people. The Anunnaki of the sky made the Ajiji bear the workload. The gods had to dig out canals, had to clear channels, the lifelines of the land. The gods dug out the Tigris riverbed, and then dug out the Euphrates. They were counting the years of loads. For 3,600 years bore the loads of excess. Hard work, night and day. They groaned and blamed each other." So what were they to do? This is the end quote here. "They appealed to their chamberlain, Ninurta, and to their counselor warrior Iliel to appeal to the gods, to the Anunnaki of the sky, to relieve them of their labors, essentially." And you know what's interesting here, before we continue on with this quote, "The great Anunnaki made the Ajiji carry the workload sevenfold." I didn't actually look into the Ajiji too much here. I was kind of focused on the Anunnaki and how they're kind of factored into here. But that to me speaks again to this hierarchy, right?
Definitely.
So the god, it's funny, it's like before man, the gods were man. And so when you get them getting sick of being man, essentially, that's where you get this next little part here, this little juicy nugget.
Yeah, so like you said, this is where it sort of starts to get juicy. The Council of the Anunnaki agrees that the gods are to be relieved, and man is created as his replacement. So that's just, I just want to think about that for a second, because that's interesting.
Yes.
That's odd.
It's kind of odd. It's like, okay, so here we are in this world. Basically, man doesn't exist yet.
No.
And they kind of just are like, well, why don't we create something that's very similar to us, but isn't us, and then we'll just get them to do the work.
Exactly. And, okay, and we're going to touch on this again in part 2 and later on with Noah and this kind of thing, but I just want to throw it out now, because the idea in Genesis is that these earlier periods of man, before the flood, was an era where humans weren't really humans. They were different. Noah himself was said to be 500 years old.
Right.
People lived to be... It was different.
They're almost demigods themselves.
Exactly.
They almost take on mythical proportions.
Exactly.
Like a King Minos or a Solomon or something, where it's like they become more than just human.
Right. And the flood itself is what changes, almost like...
Oh, it's like the reset button.
Yeah, in a way. And I mean, we could go real crazy, and honestly, I'm reminded of even things like Paracelsus and elementals and things like that, like how almost the chemistry of the earth can change, and therefore the lifespans and just the realities of earth are different and things like
Perceptions
that.
of time.
Right? Yeah, sure. Like all kinds of crazy stuff. Who knows?
That's cool.
But
actually.
but of course, so
then we get into the whole idea that these guys, so everyone is fed up with what they're doing,
Right.
and they don't want to do it anymore, and they've been digging out, essentially creating what is the landscape of Mesopotamia. And when I was referring in the very beginning, I was like, we're going to see things like they're digging out, you get reference to them digging out the Tigris riverbed, digging out the Euphrates, counting the loads. All this kind of stuff is what the actual people themselves would have been doing,
exactly.
right? So again,
Yeah,
it's a parallel to their reality. It's very cool.
It's weird, right? So Enki gets involved at this point, though, right? So
The earth god.
So I'll continue reading this here. Enki made his voice heard and spoke with the gods. On the 1st, 7th, and 15th of the month, I shall make a purification by washing. Then one god should be slaughtered. Okay. And the gods can be purified by immersion. That's interesting. Nitu shall mix clay. with his flesh and his blood, then a god and man will be mixed together in clay. So there's these references to clay over and over and over again. It reminds me of the Golem.
Yeah.
Let us hear the drumbeat forever after. Let a ghost come into existence from the god's flesh. Let her proclaim it as his living sign, and let the ghost exit so as not to forget. Let the ghost exist so as not to forget the slain god. They answered yes in the assembly, the great Anunnaki who assign the fates. Okay,
so it's being decided. They are gonna do it, and so again, right? We get it's a solution of convenience, right? Yeah. They have all these powers, they have all these abilities. So let's just take some blood from this slain guy over here and just mix it with basically, the substance of the earth that is the building block. I just love that. We've gotten so much consistency with these narratives and stuff.
Yeah.
But essentially, okay, so once they answer yes in the assembly, Goddess Mami is the one who, again, recites the incantation while mixing the blood and the clay, resulting in man. And she repeats there is reference here to her reciting the incantation, to repeating the incantation, repeating, all on the orders of Enki, the god of Earth Realm. So Enki obviously has a lot of interest in the creation of man because he doesn't want to keep laboring in these
clearly
things.
Yes.
So he's basically ordering Mami to create what comes out as 7 males and 7 females. Okay, so this is where Mami makes her voice heard by the gods.
Okay.
Quote, I have carried out perfectly the work you have ordered of me. You've slaughtered a god together with his intelligence. I have relieved you of your hard work. I have imposed your load on man. You have bestowed noise on mankind. I have undone the fetter and granted freedom. And then this is where Mami is essentially bestowed this new title of Mistress of all the Gods because of her work, which was ordered by Enki. As he's like, it's kind of like referred to as he's like watching over her shoulder and making sure she doesn't stop kind of thing.
Just leering.
Exactly. And then when the incantation is kind of done, she pinches off, as quote, pinched off 14 pieces of clay and set 7 on the right and 7 on the left. Between them, she put down a mud brick. She made use of a reed, opened it to cut the umbilical cord, resulting in 7 males and 7 females. So again, we get a reference to the reed here, which is one of the main building blocks of Sumerian society. So there's so much here that is just rich with the parallels between the natural world and their spiritual ideas and connotations.
The number 7 too is another parallel with the flood itself.
Yeah.
Because in this version it's 7 days, and then as we progress, the times change.
And even in Genesis, right, you get the whole like it was 7 days, 7 nights. God created the world.
Yes.
Lots of parallels there. So, what do you think of that whole story there?
I mean,
let's discuss a few things.
Super interesting, obviously, and we can, of course, see where these fundamental elements are going to come from for the later versions of the story and stuff like that. I'm most interested in this splitting between the idea of like what is man, what is God, and what I don't even know. Like, where is the delineation between the two? You know what I mean? Like,
is there?
That's right, because we're dealing with. I'm constantly just reminded of like Hercules and like Greek versions of like demigods, like where they are mortal to a certain extent, right?
But extend past those sort of barriers.
But there's definitely some of these connections with the language and this idea of these gods, and then wanting man to kind of take over the burden of their workload, and the idea that the era of Noah was this era where it wasn't humanity as we see it now, where it was. Life is different.
Yeah.
People were living much longer. I don't even know. A bunch of Lee Ching-Yuns back in the day.
Yeah, Lee Ching-Yun. I love that guy. That's interesting too. The whole idea that, again, right, the purpose of man as essentially the replacement of God in this perpetual servitude, and how that is later translated in the Hebrew Bible and in Christianity as exactly that. Like, man is in service to God. Man, we are not slaves, but exactly that. The servants of God, that we speak his word, that we do his bidding, all this kind of stuff. So we are seeing a lot of things that will be built off of. The idea that the gods that there's this hierarchy that gods are slaves, or not slaves, but are like forced into working essentially. And like the fact that why do gods have to work in the first place? Like, why aren't they all just chilling up at Mount Olympus and like, or wherever?
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
I know, right? Well, that's exactly it. It's like we're getting into things, ideas, concepts that are so much more ancient that like the modern like the modern version of having a god and then like the people that worship a god is like not the same. Like I'm even thinking of this almost like where you've got these gods doing their thing, the Anunnaki making decisions on a council, then you've got the sort of demigods in between, and then possibly a realm in and beyond all of this that's almost like H.P. Lovecraft style. Like there's like
the
crazy ancient gods that are way even beyond the formations that the Anunnaki are, or that these people can perceive as like having a human form or whatever else it may be. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, totally. You know, I'm kind of thinking to myself now, like this story, this early Genesis or narrative is definitely like, it's a celebration, and it's almost like a justification of the hardships of the reality that's endured by these Sumerian peoples as they're creating their own Garden of Eden, right? Like you can even think of it as a celebration of what they've achieved.
Right.
And just a way to sort of encapsulize that and immortalize that.
Well, and you have to wonder if that what they ended up achieving in their irrigation and in all this stuff, and taking a desolate space and mastering the Tigris and the Euphrates, if this was the literal Garden of Eden 2,000 years later in legend, right?
Yeah,
that
exactly.
It was a real place. A real physical place.
And it is very interesting just to think of the fact that this, again, right, one of the earliest versions of religion, we had reference when we were looking at those documentaries to the advent of cultivation of crops, right? That happened about 15,000 BC. And once that happened, and they kind of make this comment about how like man is ultimately ever curious, always trying to learn more, understand more, seek more, all this kind of stuff, and how that's how you get the birth of religion, right? This imagination, this like there has to be higher purpose, there has to be some sort of connectivity with what I am witnessing in the natural world, and how this can be connected to, exactly that, to a higher meaning. I'm sorry, I'm just repeating myself.
No, it's okay.
But this whole idea that as an earliest version, this is so close to the natural reality that was taking place. I'm sorry, I find that just so cool.
No, it's very profound. It's really cool, and obviously this ancient history stuff is our bread and butter. We love it so much.
Bread and butter, baby.
Do you want to...
Anyway, sorry, just one more thought on that whole
ahead.
thing. The idea, again, right, this celebration aspect is that they achieved so much in such a... I'm not going to say hostile, but it's such an area that needs such intervention to create what they wanted it to be in this Garden of Eden.
Definitely.
Anyways.
And I'm just saying to say it again, like... The Egyptians had it easier, like just as a frame of reference, right? So like this more ancient civilization, they had to work way harder and ended up with better results, even arguably, depending on how you're looking at it. Because this is the civilization
that's hard to judge, but
well, it's a civilization that kicked it all off, though, right?
Exactly.
It's like if things didn't go the way they did in the few thousand years leading up to the early era of Egyptian civilization, then who knows how they would have fared, even, or whatever.
Exactly.
Who knows how it all would have gone down?
Oh yeah, like there's exactly. There's so much.
I really wanted to touch on a little bit of like what we're heading into in part 2 here, though, because what we've done obviously in part 1 is like framing the legend, framing the most ancient aspects of this story of there being quite possibly a very real global flood and or a series of localized floods. Because we're working with legend and straddling the line between whether this actually happened or this is just metaphors piled on top of metaphors, right?
Exactly. If we can use these stories to actually map out a real geologic event.
Exactly. So we're heading towards that, but of course we're going to keep progressing through history here. So part 2, you guys can look forward to heading into the era of the ancient Babylonians, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which happens to have very, very, very direct connections to Genesis and the story of Noah. So we're going to get into Gilgamesh. We're going to get into the classic narrative of Noah, the possibility of there being a very real ark located somewhere.
Exactly, and people that have actually recreated versions of it.
People that have tried to find it. So we're heading into some epic expeditions and some archaeological mysteries here in part 2 for sure.
It is pretty crazy how dense all this is, and how essentially... Like, we didn't even really get into the flood.
No,
like with
we didn't yet.
We've gotten up to the point where the gods have set the stage for the next. It's almost like I'm gonna say Act 2 of the story.
They've set the stage for total devastation. Essentially.
Their own hand.
As Werner Herzog would say, they have set the stage for everyone's impending doom.
Impending doom. How will Atrahasis deal with this?
That's right.
I don't know.
This is going to be a 3-part series, you guys, just so you know. There's a lot of epic stuff to get to here, so we're really excited. But thank you so much for listening to part 1.
Yeah.
Do we have an idea of, this is a little off topic, but do we know what we're doing? We skipped Film Friday this week.
We did Strange Story Saturday.
Yeah, we had our first Strange Story Saturday.
It was really fun.
Just thought it would be a fun little thing to add in there, so we hope you guys enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And if you have any suggestions for that, toss them out. We always like to get them.
Yeah, cool stories.
Reach out to us on our social medias, you guys. Hit us up. You can email us at intotheportalmailbox@gmail.com, at intotheportalpodcast on Instagram and Facebook. Come hit us up on our group, and we love chatting with people in there. People leave ideas, and it's awesome. It's really fun.
Exactly. And if you can't get enough of Into the Portal and want to support the show and become part of our larger community, you can hop on over to Patreon. So that's just patreon.com/Into the Portal.
Yeah, and we've got some epic new episodes up this month, and another one on the way where we are actually heading into the jungles of Sumatra in search of the orang pendek.
Yeah, and we do have a couple of quick thanks to give that we didn't off the top of the episode.
Oh my God!
Got a couple new patrons.
We do indeed.
So we did want to give a thank you shout out to Chris Rustic.
What's up, buddy? Thank you so much.
And actually, I think we already did give a quick shout out, but thank you so much, Christy and Daniel.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you so much, you guys. The community's really been growing on Patreon lately, and it's awesome. It's what keeps the lights on around here, and we love doing this show. It's our absolute passion. So we love putting together the Patreon episodes for you guys, and I think people have really been enjoying them. So
I know. I had so much fun with that this month, and we've got our full-length episode that's going to be up in the next couple days.
That's right.
We just released the mini-sode last week, which I really, really enjoyed. It's bizarre. But anyways, go check it out. And we'll catch you next week.
Sounds good, all right?
Oh, and of course, thank you to Charlene Ramler, our lovely producer.
As always, that's right. Shout out to Charlene. Thank you so much. And you guys could join on and be a producer as well on Patreon too. So hit us up. Check out what we have to offer. And until next week.
This was a podcast from the thePodfix Network. You can check out more shows like it at podfixnetwork.com.